Hello and welcome to the first edition of the Capital Stewards podcast in 2025. We're 1 week into the new administration, and we've already seen a flurry of executive orders and discussions of more actions to come in the future. These are things that are going to impact your taxes, the economy at large, and your investments. So as we start the new year, I wanted to dive into what you should be on alert for as you think about your personal money, or if you're on the board of an organization, your organization's finances, and how those finances are going to intersect with some of the things that we're hearing out of Washington. We'll talk about which things will matter the most, what might happen this year, and what actions you should think about taking as the new administration's policies become more clear in the coming months. We'll talk about some of the most recent executive orders, tariffs, taxes. Those are all things that are on the docket for this episode. So in this first episode of 2025, it's kind of my primer on Trump 2.0 and your money. So let's dive in. Let's start with a flurry of executive orders issued during Trump's first week in office, which were substantial. But for most investors, despite all the news flow, I don't think there's a direct impact on your finances, at least sort of short term. However, there were some that could impact the economy as we move later into this year and next year. So let's take a look at some of the ones that are going to have the most significant economic impact. I think first up is immigration reform. That was first up in the lineup of executive orders that they rolled out. Trump announced stronger border enforcement, including using the military to enforce U.S. border laws at the southern border with Mexico. His administration also began making news by arresting and deporting illegal immigrants with criminal histories. From my perspective, it's unlikely that Trump's going to deport enough people to make sort of a significant impact on the labor market. Even if they were able to deport 1 million or more illegal aliens, I doubt those that actually have criminal history are probably making significant contributions to the real labor force. More impactful, I think, than sort of the direct actions will be sort of the signal that those things send that there's a more challenging environment here in the U.S. for potential immigrants, and it's going to likely discourage many folks from attempting to come into the country illegally, which is on net a good thing. But remember, the economy needs immigrants to take jobs and spend money. So immigration was likely a key source of growth over the last few years. And so my preference is for more immigration, but more legal immigration and less or no illegal immigration. So the risk to watch here is that the overall immigration falls to levels that make the labor market too tight, or that we don't add enough immigrants to add to consumer spending in the U.S. So I doubt the executive orders are going to do this in 2025, but the long-term impact of that, we'll have to sort of wait and see. And we might see more of that in 2026 or 2027. Trump signed 2 orders on energy. One declaring an energy emergency, quote unquote, and another encouraging more domestic energy exploration and drilling. In general, the Trump administration is going to be more friendly to energy production. That's not a surprise. We've known that since the fall. And that's a good thing. However, as we've talked about before, energy markets are global. So don't expect a drop in gas prices just because we produce more oil in the U.S. Other countries will simply sell less to balance the market. Trump also signed orders on global taxes and inflation, both of which I think are really more policy statements in my view than actual things that are going to impact you directly, at least in the short term. He's telling foreign governments that we aren't going to make a global tax deal that allows U.S. organizations to be taxed at higher rates than they would otherwise be subject to in the U.S. That's how it works today. So not much other than a statement there. On inflation, Trump is asking various agencies to study ways to bring prices down and then sort of report back to him. Again, it's more of a policy statement on how they want to guide the economy over the long term than it is something concrete that's going to cause prices to go down in the short term. Moving on to tariffs. No actions have been taken up to this point, which sparked a little bit of a market rally. There was some expectation that we might see tariffs on sort of day one, and we didn't see that. So you can see that what the market generally thinks about tariffs right there. Trump has threatened significant tariffs on Mexico and on Canada. Now he's pushed that date from the January 20th back into the beginning of February if they don't come to an agreement. My view here is that he's likely going to implement some kind of tariff. That's what he campaigned on, but not the 25% that's being discussed in the negotiations. Instead of sort of significant draconian tariffs, I think we're likely to see a renegotiation of the USMCA trade agreement. So that's the US, Mexico, Canada trade agreement. Ironically, that's the agreement that replaced NAFTA. So when you were in school, you may have learned about NAFTA. That was the North American Free Trade Agreement that allowed trade between Mexico and Canada and the U.S. for the late 90s and 2000s. He replaced that with USMCA during his first administration. So what I guess he's trying to do here is improve on his own handiwork. That agreement allows for goods to move between the US, Canada, and Mexico, like I said, without export or import taxes. The most likely gains for the US in negotiations here are higher minimum wages for workers that are making those exports in Mexico and Canada, and then also requirements around goods imported from China into Mexico or Canada for further distribution in the US. So to some extent, China's been using those countries to get around US trade policy. So limiting the ability of Chinese goods to qualify for those tax breaks will help Trump put pressure on China to make other changes that we want in our relationship with China. So while less sort of economically significant, the president's threats to Colombia over the weekend might help bring some other countries to the table. He was clear that foreign countries need to play ball, or he's ready to move on all sorts of economic levers. So tariffs remain a risk to watch, I think, as we go through the year. The market's expecting some tariffs, but nothing draconian. If we do get 25% tariffs on Mexico or Canada, or more than that around the world, then that likely will cause rates to increase and the stock market to sell off a little bit as the market adjusts to that news. So I think what's priced in now is some, but not a ton of tariffs. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we go forward. Taxes are probably the most significant issue for you. And this is probably the place where there's going to be the quickest and sort of most direct impact on your bottom line. But it's not going to be now. It's going to be as we move into the end of this year into 2026. The expectation in markets right now is that most of the 2017 Trump tax cuts are going to be extended. If they're not extended, that's effectively going to act like a tax hike on both individual investors and on companies. So I expect most of the prior changes will sort of remain as they are today. Given the fiscal situation, it would surprise me if Trump's able to lower taxes again a whole lot. Perhaps he gets something for specific groups like tipped workers. But I think getting the extension of what's in place today done is going to be hard enough on its own with the slim majorities they have in Congress. I think it's less likely that we see sort of a further reduction in taxes. But there are a couple of key things to watch for as we go through this year that might mean negotiation chips in the tax debate. So these are things to kind of put on your radar as you go through the year. The first and the most significant of those things is the standard deduction. Most taxpayers got an increase in the standard deduction in 2017 in exchange for not having as many of those one-off deductions and credits that you had to go find every single year. And that's been good. It's made tax planning easier. It's made doing your taxes easier. From my perspective, that's a really good thing. If this process results in the standard deduction, moving lower in favor of a return of those sort of old one-off kind of credits and deductions, then you should probably consider doing some significant tax planning around year end to make sure you can take advantage of all of those new one-off credits as we go into 2026. So if the standard deduction changes, I think that's a big, red blinking light that you need to maybe revisit your tax planning. I would also pay attention to the top tax bracket. So if you're in the 37% tax bracket today, or if you're close to it, if you're in the 35 today, if you're close to those top two brackets, that might be a source of negotiation for funding the remaining tax cut extension. So perhaps it goes up to 38%, perhaps it goes back to 39%. But even if they don't move the tax rate, Congress has been known to move the income threshold around for the highest rates, and they move it lower, not higher, so that it catches more taxpayers, which means you might get a tax increase even if the rate itself doesn't change, and that doesn't make the news a whole lot. So pay attention to the top rate and the brackets around the top rate. That's going to potentially be important as we go through this year. The state and local income tax deduction, or SALT, was phased out in 2017. It's more of a concern for New York and California taxpayers than it is for taxpayers in the Southeast, where taxes at the state and local level tend to be lower. SALT allows you to deduct your state and local taxes from your federal return, which means that those taxpayers in high tax states get that big federal tax deduction, but it's larger than the deduction for state and local taxes that you get in sort of lower tax states, and particularly in the Southeast. The debate over SALT always goes back to that deduction allowing the higher tax states to maintain their high rates without much protest, because the taxpayers are simply sort of transferring money to the state that they would have paid in federal taxes. So we'll see where that goes. I think there's going to be a lot of debate on that. Ultimately, I think SALT's going to probably have to come back into the code in order for them to get it through Congress. If you own a business, the qualified business income deduction or QBI, as you may sort of have heard it called, is really significant. It's up to 20% of your small business income. So an extension of QBI is really critically important for small business owners. So if you're going through the year, if you own a business, pay attention for talk around QBI. And then lastly, the estate tax exemption. It's currently 13.6 million, which means the vast majority of folks don't pay estate taxes. However, if we go back to the 2017 levels, just sort of indexed to inflation, that exemption goes from 13.6 million down to 6.8 million. And that's going to snare a lot more folks in the estate tax, and that requires a lot of planning to avoid. So if you're around the estate tax levels, if you've got, really, if it looks like they're going to, not extend the 13.6, if you got more than $5 million, it's probably time to have a conversation about that. But I would just pay attention to the estate tax. I think that's another potential chip that might get moved around a little bit this year. So that's my primer on Trump so far, the one week into the administration. I'll talk for a second about the news of today since it's moving market so much. This is not really new, but over the weekend, DeepSeek rolled out its sort of lower cost chat engine, AI chat engine, and it moved all the way to the top of Apple's App Store. And it's causing a sell-off in some of the technology stocks, particularly NVIDIA and Broadcom. The model's not quite as refined as OpenAI's or Google's, but it's very close. And it's very close, importantly, at a much lower cost. That's causing investors to question the business models of some of the US AI chip makers. If China can produce an AI model that's close to as good as the US models without sort of the best and most expensive chips, are those chips really worth paying a premium for? In my view, this was kind of an inevitable development. Moore's law, right, suggests that technology becomes cheaper and more commoditized over time. The real reason that we're seeing so much market reaction is because those stocks have been priced so high. The multiples were, and they still are, really high. And so the perfect environment for continued growth needed to exist for that to stay true. And so those firms are going to keep growing their earnings. The business model, is not under serious threat. The story is far from over. But sort of the rapid multiple expansion that we saw over the past year, that might be over as investors kind of wake up, I think, to the reality that competition is going to eat into profits over time, even at some of the best AI companies. So this fundamentally underscores why it's important to stay diversified, not get caught up in the hype around AI, or sort of any other trend for that matter. So I always like to close these with a couple of practical steps to consider now. The first is simply rebalancing your portfolio. There's a lot more economic and policy uncertainty going into this year than there was in 2024. Just like today, we're having a big down day. I think we're going to have a lot more volatility this year. So if you have too much exposure to tech or to the stock market after last year, rebalance back toward your long-term asset allocation targets. If you don't know what those targets are or think you need to revisit them, maybe that's a good time to consult with a professional that can help. On the tax front, if you own a business, if you pay taxes around the top rate, or if you might be subject to estate taxes, keep a close eye on the tax negotiations as we go throughout the year. And if there's significant changes to policy, certainly we'll talk about those here if and when we actually know what they're going to be. But it's certainly worth sitting down with your investment and tax advisors before the end of the year if we get significant changes to make sure that you're in good shape as we head into 2026. All right, that's it for this episode, and we will see you next time on the Capital Stewards Podcast.